Southeast Asia, one of the least known areas of that particular region of the world is the Kuril Islands. It's not discussed through international news outlets often due to the lack of information. Rarely is it even mentioned or depicted outside of maps or in reference to geographical information, but it's been under heavy contention from Russia and Japan throughout recent times, as there are centuries worth of reasons for such bitter disputes over a group of islands barely known to the outside world. Due to the remoteness of the region, even indigenous peoples of northern Asia or Siberia inhabited the islands. The Ainu people were an indigenous people who inhabited the islands sparsely in ancient times. However, there were no real settlements to speak of or claims to the islands as their own. Most real populations lived on modern Hokkaido, Sakhalin, or the Kamchatka Peninsula. Due to the lack of any real habitation or settlements, the islands were known to indigenous people of the region for eons, but it wasn't until modern records in roughly the 17th century make the first real mentions to the islands. The Tokugawa shogunate in Japan was the first to make a formal claim of ownership of the islands. However, the situation in Japan at the time, the claims weren't enforced, and there were often confusion about the islands from the Japanese point of view. In Japanese, the islands are called Shishima, with a rough translation of being 1,000 islands, as at the time the Japanese didn't know the exact amount of islands in that particular area, and assumed as such through contact with the Ainu as well as their own opinions of the region, but the title or name for the islands remained and became official for Japanese administration. The Russian name for the islands are a rough translation of Kuril, Kuriliske Ostrova, which is a Russian variant of the Ainu term for the islands, being that of Kur, as the islands were known in the West mostly by the Ainu Russian variant, the Kuril Islands. As originally the Tokugawa made claims to the region and had actually expected Russian interests to avoid the particular islands due to the Kuril Islands being a geographical expansion of Hokkaido, and believed that the Russians would focus their efforts elsewhere in Siberia or northern Asia. But the Russians were known throughout the 1800s for their aggressive expansions, despite formal claims or declarations from other nations with regard to territory. Smaller realms within the Tokugawa shogunate made grievances that outposts should be set up in the Kuril Islands to help promote interests in the region for Japan, as slow expansion was made into what is now known as Hokkaido and the Sakhalin. Japanese factors with developing and colonizing the regions were extraordinarily slow, and with lacking any real motivations until the early to mid 1800s, but by this time there were significant Russian claims as well as development in the region, with small but significant Russian settlements near the Kuril Islands. Russian interests with early modern Japan led to the Treaty of Shimoda, which established formalized diplomatic relations between Japan and Russia. The treaty had a whole host of problems, translations, and miscommunications between Japan and Russia, but even in modern times, the treaty is still used in discussion to speak about in foreign relations about the disputed islands. The treaty in part let Japan keep the closest islands to Hokkaido, as that were what the Russians deemed acceptable to the Japanese claims, as well as a logical buffer between what Japan controlled in Hokkaido and with what the Russians controlled in the Kamchatka. The Russians knew that if Japan had attained all of the islands, there would be no real problem for Japan for Japanese forces to ever launch an assault on the Kamchatka Peninsula, due to the islands being so close geographically for the Japanese military and quite distant for Russian military forces. However, further situations led to all of the islands being ceded to Japan with the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1875, which put all of the islands under Japanese administration, with the Japanese abandoning their claims to the Sakhalin Island. Even with full Japanese administration over the Kuril Islands, they were too far away geographically for the government to start plans for development or formal colonization. Basic plans were implemented, but there were no real results from the Japanese ownership point of view over the entire Kuril Island group. With all of what had occurred during the Second World War, there were few, if any, official declarations, treaties, or agreements for the islands. The Soviet Union, taking advantage of the nationalist and communist resistance in China against Japanese aggression, and American involvement also against Japan, meant that the Red Army took the Sakhalin Island and Kuril Islands without much resistance. It wasn't until after the war's conclusion did the Japanese government look into the exact details of the Russians taking the islands. The Soviet army also forced Japanese residents whom had settled upon the islands from the Imperial Japanese government's encouragement of land, as well as the potential and appeal of starting a new life in the Kuril Islands. The Russians believed that if the Japanese residents were to be forced out and later Russian residents brought in to populate the islands, then it would strengthen Russian claims to the islands as well as weaken Japanese claims to the islands. However, few Russians actually went to the Kuril Islands, with most preferring other settlements in Siberia, and even by Russian standards, the Kuril Islands weren't developed and not exactly worth living upon. In modern times, the Russian view is that the islands were taken from Japan on essentially the spoils of war for Russian lives lost during the Second World War against Japan. The islands are not technically important to Russia besides the oceanic zones used for fishing, but the Japanese often teach the situation in schools as the Japanese public nationally has an acute awareness of the situation in the Kuril Islands. As focus on the islands are apparent, especially in Hokkaido, where lessons are taught in public schools about the exact details of the islands favorable to the Japanese nationalist point of view. Some even consider the fact that Japan will remain a neutral force in the reacquisition of the islands until a possible future conflict in where they would be theoretically seized by force, and then expel the Russians living upon the islands in an act of what was done to their own citizens generations before to further legitimize the Japanese claim of ownership to the island in a future scenario. Whatever the fate of the Kuril Islands, their situation will be as insignificant as the islands themselves are.